Hello, this is John Tierney, and I'm going to talk about some other elements of what we do in historic graves projects, in particular some work we've been doing on using ground penetrating radar, try and look at institutional burials in Ireland, and I'm going to be touching on work we've done up in Lurgan in Armagh and Carr in Cork. Most of the work has been funded by the Royal Irish Academy. We got funding from them in 2021 and in 2024. And I'm going to be touching on the results of some of that work in this talk. And the work has been done by a multidisciplinary team, Dr. Aoife Bhreatnach of Appio Consulting. She's an institutional historian. Dr. Alastair Ruffell, geologist from Queen's University Belfast, and Dr. Paul Nessens, who's an archaeological surveyor, amongst other things. And also we had help from colleagues in University College Dublin at the start of the project. So some people will know me from the Historic Graves project, where since 2015 we've gone into surveyed nearly 1,000 graveyards in Ireland, and a handful across in Britain. And this last summer we've gone further afield out to Canada to work with a community group out there on their cemetery in St. Joseph's in Douro. Have a look at that online if you go into the front page of Historic Graves. And it's been a process of interactions and of learning from one another across the board. And one of the things we've learned about particularly has been actually burial practices and the patterns then that emerge in a burial landscape from those practices. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. How those patterns emerge, how we identify them, and then the technology that we use to try and interpret them. A key site for us in the whole process was Old Sligo Cemetery. Sligo Tidy Towns got us in for a few weeks, a long time ago, pre-COVID anyway, and we worked with some fantastic groups in Sligo. And one of the key things we learned from that was in Old Sligo Cemetery, we got down to this circle section, it's called the pauper section, and with Brian Scanlon, as we surveyed the grave markers in there, we walked from left to right across this undulating landscape, and we realised very quickly that as we went down and came back up, we were after going through a grave, because in a pauper section people don't usually buy a grave plot. Is what they do is they pay for the opening and then the closing of a grave, and subsequently the graves tend not to be reused quite in a lot of cases in Ireland and also in England, from what I've read from Professor Julie Rugg's work. Some cemeteries, okay, they're quite dynamic and the paupers burials will be disturbed, but in other cases, no, not at all. And I think that was the case there in Sligo. And we learned that unmarked graves can be identified by the grave hollows and the grave humps, and that they form particular patterns which we can then use to try and identify burial grounds elsewhere, and also burial patterns within burial grounds where there are no markers. So that was a community project where we work with local historians and with local community volunteers. But thanks to Royal Irish Academy funding, we're able to work with people like Alastair there on the left. He's got a ground penetrating radar rig there. It's like a little pram and you push it across the landscape. The flat white device there has to be in contact with the soil. That's sending signals down into the ground, and then it's receiving the signals back up in a form of radar. And then Dr. Aoife Bhreatnach is present there, and Aoife is a 19th century, 20th century historian, and the things that people like Aoife know, which is kind of are scary, infant burial, infant death rates in the 19th century and 20th century. It's just the things they study and the things they know about. To me, as an archaeologist, it's kind of easy if you're looking at a grave shaft or a grave hollow or whatever, but for them, they're reading the statistics on some quite bleak parts of our history. But this is a multidisciplinary team, and what we do is combined Aoife's skills with our skills in the field, and then Alastair's technical skills, and then his broad range of experience as well. And we try and combine all those and learn from one another. Very often in the projects, it's learning to speak the same language. That's what's happening in the field. That Aoife will have a particular approach because of her historical training. We have a different approach because of our archaeological training. And then as a geologist, also involved in forensic searches, that Alastair has another way of approaching things. And when you're in the field together, you're learning how to speak the same language. the context that we're working in a lot of cases, we're looking at pretty much all 19th century institutional burial. A lot of that's connected in with the Poor Law Acts of, 1838, that from then onwards that there are these institutional responses to burial and periods of overwhelm. The main one that we have in Ireland that we're all conscious of is the Great Famine of, let's say, 1845 to 1852. If you read Professor Cormac O'Grady, as he's saying, okay, 1 million dead and 1 million lost to immigration is plausible if not proven. And I love that sentence because it shows you that, okay, there seems like there's a lot of facts out there, but if you have a professor of history or economic historian saying not proven, we've got to be cautious about everything that we do, and we've got to be fact-based. And the approach that we have to that, for me as a field archaeologist, has been a kind of an experience, because I never thought I was going to be going into a map of the workhouses of 19th century Ireland and early 20th century Ireland and doing archaeology on them. When I started in the game, I had no interest in that kind of thing, and now I find myself very interested in mapping, and in this case, sites like Carr's Hill, where the arrow is down at the bottom, and then up top, up at Shankill in Lurgan, in Armagh, working with the local group up there. And we're studying the physical remains of 19th century institutions, and then we're also parsing the legislation of that time. This is an 1878 Public Health Act, and it relates to rules and regulations relating to burial grounds. And when you parse that, for me as an archaeologist, it's fascinating, where if you parse a legal document, you can get definitions of particular types of burial structure. And if you parse it in one way, it makes it very simple. There's two types of graves that we have in Ireland. There's walled graves and there's unwalled graves. If you're used to seeing vaulted tombs in County Cork, where there'll be lime mortar stone walls, or let's say brick-lined graves, they're walled graves. And then if you get an ordinary earth-cut grave shaft, that's an unwalled grave. Just split it into those two categories, and already you're getting a different control and a different understanding of what burials are. Reading the legislation, then it also splits burials into family and non-family usage, coffined and uncoffined burials, adult and sub-adult burials. I never thought it would be so interesting, but when you read historical documents like this with a historian like Aoife, you learn an awful lot, and that transfers itself then into how we try and interpret the physical features of burial structures of that period. We also use archaeological methodologies, and one of my favourites is Professor Caroline's study called Holocaust Archaeologies. Just read that, and it's a manual for how to approach the more recent burial, the archaeology of the more recent burials that we have. And I'm also, I found Catherine Nichols's work in Canada. I think she did a master's on it, but I found it very strong. From it ticked all the boxes from my archaeological background, and that's also, I think, why I like Caroline Sturdy-Coll's work. It's a lot of her forensic archaeology is based on field archaeology methodologies. Different ultimate avenues of proof are followed, but you can see it has a very strong basis in terms of my own background and the things that I've learned. So we try to apply her very strong methodology to the sites that we're looking at now. And these are the sites that we're looking at now. This is Carr's Hill a few years ago, just at the start of COVID. I called in there one day, and that's what the site looked like. It's just overgrown. More than half the site was overgrown with brambles up at chest height, and very hard to see. What we found out subsequently, thanks to a RIA Archaeology Academy grant, is that pretty much that whole landscape is covered in graves. And I'll come to that in a minute. But how do you match that type of environment with what we want to find out? Like, Carr's Hill is notorious in Cork for being a famine burial ground, but where were the famine graves? We didn't know. So in 2021, we got a grant to work on to do some drone surveys of sites, and with Dr. Steve Davis in UCD. Paul Nessens did flyovers using a drone. We made ground models in QGIS, this GIS package, and then Steve Davis got copies of some not commonly available LiDAR, and when we looked at those, we were able to determine, we've got here in Gart. Christy Cuniff told us go down and look at the workhouse burial ground in Gart, and we found long trench graves there, more than 40 metres long. I think there's one actually there towards the bottom right hand corner that was excavated as a grave, but was never actually used as a grave. It sits there's sitting water in that trench anytime I've gone up to it, so I think they never got into that. But that was interesting for us, is that locally those trench graves are believed to be famine related. But then when you talk to the farmer, who's a very nice man who's working that field, he has sheep in there. Occasionally, if he goes across that field topping thistles or whatever in his wee tractor, he'll tell you the whole landscape is undulating, and he says it's just the most uncomfortable ride you can have as you're topping the thistles in there. And I suspect that a lot of those dark splodges that you can see from the LiDAR survey are actually individual graves covering pretty much the whole landscape. And this was one of my 5K sites that we went to during COVID. My daughter was working on the workhouse as a history project for her leaving cert, and then we called into this burial ground as part of that. We were allowed into the workhouse in Dungarvan during lockdown, and then we called back up into the site. And when we went in there, I just couldn't see the graves. I could see one or two of them, but it's then when we got the RIA Archaeology Academy grant and we got the remote sensing going at it, the drone-based remote sensing, we realised pretty much that whole site is also covered in graves. In that slide there, every one of those dark dimples, they're very strong on the right-hand side, but pretty much if you squint your eyes and follow it, it's across the whole site. They're all graves. Which of them are mass graves from the famine, we don't know. There's one rectangular feature in the middle there, that's a cross, and a cross base and a curved cross base, but it's not a grave. But the rest of the dark dimples are all grave features. And we also, in that 2021, also used some available LiDAR to produce this image, and we said, gee, we could see the dark narrow graves on the left hand side with that pointed section, but in the middle we saw all these dark dimples, and then down towards the middle we saw rows of dark dimples, and then there's also potential trench graves. And then off on the right, could there be a lot of narrow single graves there? We're not sure. By 2021, we had lots of, we now knew what was under the vegetation that was in that earlier photograph, what's under all those brambles. And what was fantastic about Carr's Hill is that nobody improved the ground. Nobody brought in soil to level it off to make it easier to get in there. And as a consequence, nobody masked the burial features that are there, the graves that are there. They're still there waiting to be further study to be done on them. And the whole study approach we're taking is zero excavation, rest in peace. As we've worked with community groups all over Ireland, rest in peace is a very strong thing for the people, and I think we've taken that on board, and there's no aspiration at all to go rooting at any of these graves, and we've learned that from those community groups. So one of the first community groups there who got us looking at famine graves was up in Shankill in Lurgan, up in Armagh, and we worked with the local municipality up there, and working with the Friends of Shankill, we recorded 391 gravestones. Isobel up there had done an awful lot of research, and she had a lot of inscriptions read, and we pulled it all together to match it with our survey. And I think Isobel and Co are going to produce a book on this soon. But basically, we have the names and dates for all those gravestones there. And in the story, the Brownwells in Lurgan had a very strong, they had to address the problems that they had up there during the famine. And one of the stories in relation to that was that there are workhouse burials inside in Shankill. And Dr Alastair Ruffell had already looked at them, looking for them using his GPR buggy, his pram, let's say. That's the trail that he walked over that whole site, trying to see a distinctive profile that actually represents what might have been a mass grave or a common grave. And the two main areas that were considered to be locally as to potentially where you might get famine graves are that orange box and then where the red arrow is. And this is from some of the drone work that Alastair and a student of his worked on. And to me, they were the two main areas. And when I had a look at them myself, I got up there looking at the gravestones, but then also looking for what matches with other famine graves that we see down the country. And we had a potential area there on the left, all right, but when we went over and back on it with Alastair's rig with the RIA Archaeology Academy in 2024, none of the strong features showing burials really stood out there, but we did get something on the right-hand one, all right. And because we had recorded all the gravestones and the dates and things on them, we were able to actually filter the burial, the gravestone record to see there on the at the above. There's two gravestones there that date from the period 1845 to 1852. So not a huge amount of gravestones went in that part of the graveyard anyway. And then for 1850 to 1860, there was more burial going on then. And later on in the decade then, there's far more burial then going into all across the site. But we really had no indication. And if I shoot back, that orange section there, Alastair did an awful lot of traverses over that, but nothing strongly grave indicated. The brilliant thing about ground penetrating radar is that when it does hit a grave, it gets this fantastic parabola, kind of an upside down U, and that comes in the cross section. And we were seeing that in lots of places that match with visually identified graves. But down there where there weren't grave markers as such, we just weren't getting the results. So as I was there across a couple of weeks working with the local community, recording all the gravestones, we came up with an area off to the east that potentially it looked like some of the what were called famine graves down the country, roughly 2.5 meters by 2.5 meters, a nice wee hollow in the middle and slight rises on the edge. It just had that kind of dimensionality that is in common with other sites that we've seen. I'm thinking of places like Abbey's Well in County Cork. There's plenty of other sites we go to where the community will say there's supposed to be the famine graves there, and we find it hard to identify the structure. But in some cases, we do see structures on the ground by the shape of the ground, humps and hollows. And this part of Shankill did have humps and hollows that we thought was very interesting. And you can see there on the right-hand part of the slide that distinctive parabola effect that is very often indicating the start of a burial feature. And the burial feature can be something like, it can be a load of rock over top of a grave, it can be limestone over a grave, it can be the top board of a coffin and air pockets under that, representing and we've worked with Alastair and other sites, and we've proven that those parabola features are directly connected to graves and to burials right underneath them. So we find the method very strong. And what we found in this pocket of Shankill is that we were hoping that we would see multiple burials underneath one another. But the thing about the type of ground penetrating radar device that was used, an excellent device, but once it hits something, anything that's underneath that then is masked. So you're getting pretty much the top part of any burial. And what we found is that in that section that we looked at, a square section, is that we got a lot of burials. I don't know if you can see my mouse here. I'm hoping you can, but there in that cross section you're seeing a rake of burials there, and that corresponds with this section in here. And then as Alastair ran that through his device, what happens is the Mala ground penetrating radar, it gives you live results in the field. So it's fantastic. You're walking across a grave, you're going down into a grave hollow and coming up the other side, and then at the same time you're getting readings from the radar. It's very good for the archaeologist and the geologist then to actually discuss that together. But then it also, what it does then is when Alastair goes back to base and then processes the data, it then gives you a second chance, a second bite of the cherry to tell you some more about the burial features that are in there. And what we saw in this instance was we were able to interpret it upcast from the grave excavations, and then actually what was visible in the ground probing radar is that there was a grave here, and then there was a bank of ground that wasn't dug, and then there was another grave then on the other side. So we actually had two graves side by side, and some and burials indicated in that. So this was methodologically in Lurgan very interesting for us, but I can't say that we have a common grave there or that we have a mass grave. I can't say that that looks like any of the famine graves that we have been examining down the country. I think it's been a very useful survey, but we still haven't found the famine burials inside in Lurgan. After we did this, we went back down to the other prime area, and we went at that using a similar methodology, and again, we couldn't find the burials down there. Where we have found the burials then is way down practically on the south coast in County Cork. All Saints Cemetery or Carr's Hill, as we knew it growing up. I grew up in Cork City. Carr's Hill is what we call that graveyard, and it was in the ownership of the Health Board, Southern Health Board, which became the HSE, and now ownership has been transferred to the local authority in Cork City Council. And this is what the site looked like 4 years ago when we got the RIA Archaeology Academy grant. Only one little pocket of it had the vegetation cut, and I think what happened was the HSE actually looked after the site very well. They had a very light touch approach to it. There was no heavy-handedness at all, and basically what they did is every few years they cut the vegetation. Every year they cut it from the gate in as far as the Iron Cross that was erected by Mr. Sorensen, and people were able to come in and do annual commemorations then. But they didn't fill in any features, they didn't mask any features, and I think it's a very exciting landscape that's after appearing here, that the cemetery floor contains hundreds and hundreds of identifiable grave features, narrow, wide and long. And I think it's a type site really for 19th century institutional burials. What do I mean by long? This is what I mean. 2 years ago, vegetation was cut down to ground level, and we were able to see features like this. Where you see the ranging rod there, that's at the head of a grave, and that long grave continues back for another 20 metres, where we've left that grass longer. That's inside in the grave. There's a video from RIA, it's on YouTube, and if you look for Mr. Sorensen, the man who actually was instrumental in remembering the famine dead and other people dead of Cork City buried up here. There's a video of Mr. Sorensen walking across that feature and down into it, almost like a ditch on the side of a field. And it was only when I got to the site during COVID I realised Mr. Sorensen was walking across the grave itself, and that's what you can see there. So the other types, that's a long grave, which based on our GART visits back in 2021, I thought this was potentially famine graves. But Aoife Bhreatnach's research showed it to actually be early 20th century. These then are what we're more comfortable at thinking. These are more likely to be the famine graves, about 2.5 metres by 2 metres, and that there's nearly 30 of them in the site. There's 27, 28 across the site. And that's, if you were to ask me, what does a famine grave look like? When I go down to places like down in Abbeystory, down in Skibbereen, I find it very hard to read what they have down there, and I'd love to meet the group down there and trying to decipher what they have. But if you can come back up to Dunmanway, it's features like this. If you go up to Abbeyswell in North Cork, you get features closer to that. And then here in Carrashill, we're getting rakes of these slumped, untouched features. And then in the more modern 20th century usage of the graveyard in Carrashill, there in the distance, what you can see is just rows of narrow graves and not trench graves at all. But that whole part of the site was actually covered in those narrow graves in pretty much all 20th century. And if I had people who were involved in the Besborough burials who knew that their family were buried up in, who had died in St Finbar's and then were probably buried up to Carrashill, it's down in this section that we think that they're buried. So under a Royal Irish Academy grant, we identified 4 areas. We call them here Grid 1, Grid 2, Grid 3 and Grid 4. Grid 1 was in one of the trench graves. Grid 2 we think is in narrow graves, which are potentially dating from the 1847 onwards. History is complex. If you're getting mass graves or common graves dug, you can also be getting single graves excavated and dug alongside them. People in Ireland had agency. People are always trying to work out solutions. You mightn't have the money to bury Grandad back in the 1847 in his own grave, or back in your parish graveyard, but you might have a few pennies that you could give a gravedigger who'll bury him individually inside in Carrashill, and those kind of things. Just based on what's going on the ground, I think some of that was going on, and that's what Grid 2 would be. Grid 3 then, we think, based on the reading of the Ordnance Survey maps, we think the primary 1847 burials are up there along that bank line there where Grid 3 is shown. And then if you go down to Grid 4, we recorded one particular trench there using ground penetrating radar. But you can see, if you squint your eyes, you're seeing rows of graves down there in that corner. And I know Aoife's historical research is talking about multiple coffins inside in those narrow graves. Probably so we would call them common graves. So non-familial related people buried inside in the same earth-dug grave shaft. So this is just to illustrate, if you look at the LiDAR readout there on the left, there's little red triangles at the top. What happens is when you're walking across the feature using the GPR rig is that these parabola pop up on the screen, and then the surveyor in the field tags them using the device. So you're getting live feedback. And we tagged all those red triangles. And then in the analysis afterwards, the post-processing analysis, then Alastair also adds in orange, in this case tags, to indicate other graves. Other burial features that are indicated on those in those particular readouts. So in the field, we spent a lot of time talking to one another about, okay, what does this mean? Because me as an archaeologist, I'm looking at the microtopography going down and then leveling out and then coming back up. And Alastair would be standing in the grave and he's saying, looking at his screen, he said, I'm getting nothing from this. And I'm saying, but you're in the grave. And then he's saying, but I'm looking at this device and I'm looking for the radar feedback. So we had to learn how to actually develop a common language in that. And in the same vein, that's what we're at now. We're looking at a few other sites using this data, and we're now looking at the later analysis to see how can we now actually get more information from that. And this is generally what we're looking at, is that there's two ways of doing the ground penetrating radar. You can do, let's say, 2D surveys, which is you just walk all over the place with focus, but you're only doing a single traverse. Or then what you can do is you can do a far more detailed 3-dimensional approach, and that's what we did in these. So you'd set up, let's say, a 5-meter grade over your 2.5-meter grave, and then you traverse that site, let's say, north to south, every 50 centimeters. So that would give you, let's say, 11 scans going across the site, and then you reverse and you go perpendicular to that and you do another 11 scans. So it's like having a cake and then chopping it up into squares. And then the software allows you to then look at each of the scans and see, can I see burial features? And this is what a single burial feature would look like. On the left is what it looks like on the screen or on a printout, and then on the right is where Alastair has analysed it. So he's saying the red dotted line is showing collapse of the ground, which to me is probably the bottom of the grave fill. That there was probably a coffin or a line of stone or a line of limestone underneath that. And then what he calls the hyperbola from the top of the burial. That to me in simplistic terms is the U, the upside down U shape that's showing where the burial is. And then he's got this thing where he's called a side swipe from the edge of the coffin. Because a single parabola masks what's underneath it, you're not really sure what's there underneath. Sometimes you'll get a kind of reflectance. That's not the right term, but you will get some bit of a peak underneath what's off to the side. A big part of what we're doing now is Alastair is now looking at technology to see is how can we look at underneath a feature. And there are devices for that, and hopefully we'll get access to them in Ireland soon. So we'll be able to say, okay, we have burials at about a metre down. What's underneath those? Is the next thing of what we're going to do. And then if you've 11 slides going north to south, and then you've another 11 slides going east to west, then we're looking at each one of those, and we're getting this kind of data there from Carr's Hill. And when you look at them, then you're interpreting these kind of features. So grid 1 up top, that's inside in a trench grave that we believe is 20th century. So where the B's are there, where any place you see a letter B under grid 1, that's where Alastair can see burials inside in that trench. Grid 2 then is supposed to be narrow graves, and we're finding that quite hard to read. He's got a grave, he's got a burial up in the top corner of that particular scan, but I would expect the burials to be in the centre, so we're not really getting much information there. Grid 3, which I think is 1847, probably the original George Carr graves, that's there under grid 3. And what we're seeing is we're seeing burials at quite a shallow level, and then they're masking then what's underneath those. So there's far more detail in that to come. And then in grid 4, which are the narrow 20th century graves on the western corner, this is a single grave there where he's got a B, but Alastair's interpretation is he can make out at least 2 burial features inside in that single grave, which tallies with Aoife's approach, whereby she's getting records of multiple coffins inside in one grave. So the ground probing radar is now showing us the graves, the burials that are inside in those features. And now across the next short while, we're actually teasing all that apart to see, can we actually say more about it? Like what the kind of things we want to say more about, and this is based on Aoife's work, is that, for instance, the cemetery in Carr's Hill didn't open until 1847. And George Carr, who got the contract for opening the cemetery, even though he was an employee of the workhouse, he charged for the burial of 2,216 people between February 1847 and June 1847. So 2,000 people went in there. They went in here somewhere in 1847. So see those dark dimples up top? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's a few more off the edge. Let's just say there's 10 of them from 1847. And in half of the year, there's 2,000 people buried up there somewhere, inside in those 2.5 meter grave hollows. So that's 200 people per grave. Seems like an awful lot of people to fit into what the gravedigger at the time said was a 12-foot grave. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to see how can you fit, what kind of burial feature do you need that will actually take 2,000 people across 6 months, and how many people can you fit into a grave? And we're talking to grave diggers, and we're talking to historians all over the country to try and get their information on this. So our broad interpretation currently is that the 1847 graves, based on first edition Ordnance Survey maps, are up right against the bank up there where I'm indicating 1847. It's slightly wider than that. It's even possible that each of those dimples in the middle there under 1847, 28 of them, they actually form rows of those wide graves. That could be the whole famine period there marked in there. If you come down underneath the 1847 indicator. We think the 19th century narrow burials are there on the right. The long graves then, and we know at least one of them is 1908, are there in the bottom middle section. And then the 20th century narrow graves are all there off on the left. So we record them on the surface using LiDAR, handheld LiDAR. We draw what the surface looks like to us on the ground, and then we combine that with the ground penetrating radar, and then we pull all that into a GIS package like this, and then we enumerate all the graves that are inside in that cemetery. So we have what we're calling short or narrow graves in blue, and then we have long and wide graves, red, green. So you can see that the wide and long graves are all in the middle of the site, and then we have narrow graves to the east and to the west. So as we look at these and we try and understand them, we're trying to build models for what institutional burial features look like. And the models are based on things like the proportion of the dimensions of the length, of the width and the depth of the graves, whether there's coffins discernible inside in the graves, the number of interments, the number of interment layers. Can you have a body at one shrouded body on top of another without soil between? Can you have one coffin and another without soil in between? The orientation of the interments, are they east-west? Are they keeping to the adhering to the liturgical east? Is there soil cover at the top of a grave? In Carr's Hill, they said they had 5 foot of soil cover after they'd put in all the graves. They never told us how many. After they'd put in all the coffins, they never told us how many coffins they were putting into each grave. What they did say is that they were putting in lime. They said they put lime into the coffins and on top of the coffins after they went into the graves. Now, if they were doing an awful lot of that, my tendency is, you've got to take that as evidence. Potentially they were doing the things that they said they were doing. But then you've got to test and see how much of it you can actually measure. If they were putting in lots of lime between the coffins, they weren't going to be fitting 200 people in a single grave or anything near that. So we're still at the place of trying to kind of decipher all of this. And so there's other things then that we are trying to analyse and model when it comes to looking at these kind of burial practices in the 20th century. One of the main things we've learned from talking to people who've dug graves is that the tighter the fit you can have between the coffin and the side of the grave, the better. So it's very important for us, based on ground evidence, to say, is this trench 2 meters wide or is it 2.5 meters wide? Because your average coffin is 50 centimeters wide. So if the trench grave is 2 meters wide, that's 4 coffins. But if it's 2.5 meters wide, that's 5 coffins. And so those kind of individual features on the ground are very important. Basically, the tighter the grave shaft, the better the fit, and the better the grave will operate. So the accuracy of dimensions is very important for us, whether we're recording the ground surface or we're using the GPR to actually get those kind of dimensions. And then we're producing models like this. How can we simplistically break down different institutional burial features? So this would be from an institution, from an asylum up in County Westmeath. And we know in St. Lomans in Mullingar is that everybody got a coffin and that everybody got their own grave. And for the few that we were able to look at as we were doing particular types of research, that in a lot of cases the graves weren't actually very deep, that they were going down 3 foot. the coffin was a foot high, and then there was 2 foot of soil going on top of that. And that's what those particular types of models are actually showing to us there, and that the people were buried east-west, as in their head was at the west, they were facing east in the Christian model. So if we can look at institutional burial practices like this, and then move on to other ones, like famine-related ones, like in Carr's Hill, we can model the individual graves like that, but we still don't know how many burials are inside in each one of them. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's less than 30 burials inside in a single grave shaft. And if we know they were burying 2,000 odd people inside 6 months, those single graves, those 2.5 metre wide graves up in the middle of Carr's Hill, they just won't take 2,000 people. There's something else going on there as well. But we need to model that to try and work out what's going on. The long graves in Carr's Hill, are they being buried lengthways, head to toe? Are the bodies being buried sideways, perpendicular to the run of the grave? Or are they being buried sideways and opposite to one another? When we look at the archaeology of this, people like Cullen and Driscoll have excavated the tops of a number of burial pits in Carlow Town, in the workhouse there, and they've found burials both running lengthways down the length of a trench grave or a pit grave, and then also he has them going across the grave opposite to one another, similar to what we're seeing there in option 3. So we have to spend a lot of time looking at the archaeology of these grave features. There haven't been a huge amount of excavations, but there's enough done that it can inform us. And we're hoping that as we tweak the precision and the actual techniques used with the ground penetrating radar, is that we'll be able to use questions raised by the archaeological excavations, try and address them using the remote sensing or the non-invasive, like the ground penetrating radar. So as we come to the end of this, the whole process for us is what's going on, like how are we burying our people? And what we know is that in Ireland, families bury their people in graves. And I've said this before in some other talks. And then parishes bury their people in rows of graves, because each family gets its own grave, and then this family puts a grave alongside that family, and another one puts alongside that and alongside that. And the row is the tidiest way to organise lots of people. And then what happens in 19th and 20th century institutions is that there's a tension between the institutions. Some of them want to present narrow graves and individual graves, that if Johnny dies, then Johnny gets his own grave. But then others then are saying, well, Janie, like there's 2 people after dying this week, there's 20 people after dying last week, we're going to have to dig a bigger grave, and we're going to have to put more people into that. So that's a tension between single and common burial. And what we're finding is that if one person dies a week in a parish, or if one person dies a week in an institution, anybody can handle that. You just got to dig one grave a week. But if the death rate is higher than that, is that it's quite stressful and it's very difficult. You need professional grave diggers then, and you need professional burial systems. Like if I had funding, I'd be straight up to Glasnevin, because they have burial features recorded and in their paperwork. I'd go up there and I'd recover the physical remains of the graves inside in Glasnevin, and I'd correspond that then with the historical records that they have. So that's something that hopefully can be done in the near future. But when an institution is overwhelmed, like in Cork, where they were having 24 burials or 24 deaths in one day, at the peak of the worst of the period, then the system collapses, and then you got to come up with other solutions. So we're seeing periods of collapse, we think, of system collapse, and then recovery. And in periods of collapse, they're using common graves and what some people might call mass graves. But then when things settle down, they'll go back into trying to bury people individually. And then depending on the arm wrestle that's going on in local politics, some political parties will say, oh, we got to keep it in the budget, and everybody goes into a trench grave. Or if they can't afford it themselves, we're going to stick them all in the trench. And then other parties are saying, no, that's no way to treat our people. You've got to give them single graves. And that whole tension, I think, is a common part of late 19th century and a good chunk of the 20th century, or certainly the start of the 20th century. So doing all this, first of all, we must parse the burial legislation. We need to record how families bury their people, and then we need to record how institutions bury their people. one of the key ways I think of doing that we're really not doing is that we need to go out and talk to the grave diggers and the cemetery managers. There's people now who are retired grave diggers and cemetery managers who know an awful lot. And that I suppose I'm here making a case. I'd love to have funding to go and do more ground penetrating radar, to use the new devices that are coming out that will look underneath the coffins for us. Yeah, I do want all that, but if I really wanted what's the most critical thing to do, it's to go out and talk to all those types of people and learn from them about how professionals bury people and what different kind of practices that they've encountered and what different types of features that they've encountered, and let's get the information from them too. So combine this multidisciplinary approach of archaeologists working with historians, working with surveyors, and then working with practitioners as well. I think if I wanted to conclude, and I conclude on that. Okay, I hope this recording worked, and I hope that was of some sense to people. In the coming months, we're going to continue with teasing apart what's going on with the ground penetrating radar and trying to look at each of those slices that cuts across those burial structures, those grave structures, and tell us more about what happened to our people as they died in these institutions over the last 200 years.